Good morning, everyone. I'm Nia Johnson, the director of the Roundtable on Science and Welfare of Animals Involved in Research. And on behalf of the Board on Animal Health Sciences, Conservation and Research, which was formerly ILAR and is now BASCR, I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Advancing Community Engagement by Using a Universal Protocol Template, or UPT. We're thrilled to have so many of you join us as we explore this important new resource for the research community. It has been thoughtfully designed to serve as a foundational tool for researchers and institutions engaged in studies involving animals. While it is not mandated by USDA or OLAW, the template outlines the minimum requirements for an IACUC protocol, helping to clarify expectations and support best practices across the field. This webinar is an opportunity to not only learn about the UPT's key features and applications, but also to engage in meaningful discussions about how it can enhance clarity, compliance, collaboration, and research involving animals. Our goal today is to create an open and engaging environment where we can collectively explore the potential of this template to advance both science and animal welfare. Your insights, questions, and feedback will be invaluable as we chart the path forward. Before we dive in, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thanks to everyone involved in organizing this webinar. I'd like to also acknowledge the Roundtable for its continued commitment to fostering dialogue and innovation in the science and welfare of animals involved in research. I truly hope that this session inspires productive discussions and provides practical insights that you can take back to your respective institutions and organizers. Thank you for joining us. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to just point out that we are using Slido for anyone who would like to submit a question to be asked during the Q&A portion of the webinar discussions. Next slide, please. For the meeting logistics, we ask that everyone make sure that when you are speaking, you are supporting a distracted-free environment. We also would ask that everyone turn on their cameras as it supports a more collegial environment for us. Since we're meeting virtually, it just makes it a more personable experience. Next slide, please. Again, I briefly mentioned the Roundtable and the Board on Animal Health Sciences, Conservation and Research, which is both organizations which are housed under the National Academy of Sciences. This webinar today is being hosted through the National Academy of Sciences, which houses the Board on Animal Health Sciences, Conservation and Research, which is BASCR, and the Roundtable. Next slide, please. This webinar, as I mentioned, is being hosted in collaboration with the Roundtable, and this is a list of all of the sponsors of members who are participating in the Roundtable. Next slide, please. I'd also like to let everyone know that we do have a Roundtable mailing list, and if you are interested in receiving the quarterly updates, we are sending out sponsor updates to everyone. Please feel free to use this QR code to sign up for our updates. That way you can be alerted to everything that's going on with the Roundtable, all the activities that we have going on, and you'll receive the information directly in your inbox. Next slide, please. And now I'll turn it over to Sally Thompson-Iritani. Dr. Thompson-Iritani is the current chair of the Roundtable.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I am so excited to listen in on this webinar this morning and really appreciate people coming and joining us. I think another one that people may be asking some questions about as they go through this webinar, we've been talking about the compliance unit standard procedures, and we just wanted to make sure that people have a quick status update that these compliance unit standard procedures are live. They have started being available to people that are members of organizations that are members of the FDP. And if you have any questions, there's some QR codes here that you can link to, and we plan to open it to all institutions in the summer of 2025. I want to give a shout out to the team there. That's Dr. Aubrey Schoenleben has been really joining everyone together to move that forward. Also, there will be a town hall for the CUSP on February 6th. So please register for that and join the team, and we'll move forward. And so excited to see all of you this morning. And now turn it back over to Nia and others. Thank you.
And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Bill now.
Thank you. Good morning, Nia, and thank you to all and Sally. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is a long worked project, and we have been working on this for a lot of years. So I'm happy to bring it to fruition and chat with you guys. So I'm going to start. I don't believe Dr. Banks is here yet. I think he will join us eventually, but Ron is a dear colleague that has been working with me as part of the IACUC Administrators Association for years. Ron is now retired and acting as a consultant, but he still remains faculty and one of the primary administrators for IACUC Administrators Association activities. And I'll talk a little bit about what the association is briefly in a moment, since that's where UPT really started. My name is Bill Greer, and for those of you that don't know me, currently my role is Assistant Vice President for Research at the University of Michigan, where I also serve as the Director of the Animal Care and Use Biosafety Office and other areas of oversight. I've been in this type of career for about 35 years now, probably 15 years in pharmaceutical companies making animal vaccines, 15 years approximately at Penn State as a compliance director, and now in my role here. Let's see, I'm going into my 9th year here. So next slide. It's enough about me. So today what I want to do, I'm going to give you a few disclaimers. These are just the goals. So I want to give some background and the historical perspective on the UPT, especially if this is the first you're hearing of it. We've worked a lot with FDP, so if you've been involved with FDP or you've been part of IACUC administrator best practice meetings over the years, you may be aware of it, but this will give you a little more details. So we'll go through the disclaimers. We'll talk about the role of the researcher. Then I'll give you a historical view and talk about the 2 different types of forms. I'll probably go through 1 through 4 as quickly as possible and leave more time for us to actually look at the protocol form, look at the way the questions are formulated, and give everyone an opportunity to discuss the whole concept and the idea behind UPT. So next slide. So one of the first disclaimers I want to make is I'm not here today to convince any of you to drop your current form and jump on this one at all. As mentioned, it's not being endorsed by IAA, IACUC Administrators Association, USDA, OLAW. Nobody's mandating it. This is just a dear project that we worked on for years, and we've had a lot of people engaged in the development of this product. So what I ask, though, is to be able to truly appreciate, I encourage you to think beyond the limitations of your current protocol form. As you'll learn later on, that was one of the stumbling blocks for bringing this to fruition with FDP. And it ended up going from IAA to FDP and our federal partners involved and back to IAA, and now finally here to the academies in this group for an opportunity to make it available. So again, please think outside of the limitations of your own and think into this with more detail and understand our goals here. So with that, let's go to the next disclaimer, please. I think it is important to say and important to note as part of the slides, I believe the slides will be available to you later on. This UPT, again, is not formally endorsed by any organization, but it is a product of many, and it has input from a lot. The idea behind this started as collaborative efforts through the IACUC administrators' best practice meetings. It evolved finally to FDP. and subcommittees within FDP, and then went back to working groups that regularly involved representatives from not just the community, the IACUC administrator community, but also folks from OLAW, VA, and USDA. So again, the important point here is don't feel that this is a mandated product. It is a resource, and it is something you can look at and you can figure out whether or not part or all of this works for you. But you can look at some of the concepts and the ideas behind it and then decide for yourself and on behalf of your own institution. Next slide. Okay, so the final disclaimer, the UPT, although it was developed with the idea of universal use, it can serve as, it does serve as an IACUC protocol form. The idea was and still is to develop and maintain a form that meets the minimum regulatory requirements of the Animal Welfare Act regulations, PHS policy, guide, and other important regulatory documents. So while it is not mandated or endorsed by anyone, the use of UPT by, for example, Great Eastern University has been assessed to align with the regulatory standards. And the use of this document will help to ensure that institutions are maintaining compliance during the reviews of all animal activities and the various actions that are required through the IACUC. So next slide, please. So this is a fun slide. Long back, I got a lesson from somebody that said, well, where is Great Eastern University? And I just wanted to make note that if you're scratching your head and you never heard of Great Eastern University, it is a common place that we use in publications and discussions regarding regulatory matters. It is the place where scenarios happen regularly. It is indeed a fictitious organization. It doesn't exist and I've never been there, but it is PHS assured and it is registered with USDA and it has ALAC accreditation. And that is just for our own benefit and for us to be able to look at scenarios and consider various things from an institution's perspective. So at one point and the other, when we're around or sitting at a round table and we're talking about things, all things are happening at Great Eastern University, and they help us to appreciate all the challenges that Great Eastern University can encounter. So with that, let's jump on to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the researcher. I think it's important, and I'm not telling anybody something they don't already know. The researchers are the primary stakeholders of the animal care and use programs. Without researchers, basically all of us are out of jobs. There's no protocols for us to oversee. There's no animals for veterinarians to care for. And there's no need for adherence to laws governing animal care and use. So I think it's important for us to recognize, and this is a tough job for all of us, as we are charged with maintaining compliance over the research. And researchers, as we know, are focused on their research. But nevertheless, it's important for us to realize that they are primary stakeholders and we need to get their buy-in and we need to trust some of the things that they do. So the challenge for all institutions has always been traditionally to get researchers fully engaged beyond their research and beyond the research goals. And what does that mean? It means to have them have a strong appreciation for the goals of our animal regulations, and that is to ensure the welfare of our animal models, animals being used in research, and to help and provide opportunities for oversight and ensuring compassion for these critters that we use. So with that pitch, let me jump on to the next slide. So by embracing this culture and the idea of empowering researchers to work alongside animal care and use program staff, the idea is to have this goal-oriented program that always prioritizes animal welfare and animal well-being, but at the same time helps to facilitate impactful and productive research. And the idea that this research advances knowledge and contributes to the well-being of both humans and animals is critical to our drive to continue to use animals for research endeavors. And it is very important that not only the compliance and veterinary teams pay attention to the regulatory requirements, which are there to ensure animals are only used when necessary, and that when used, their well-being and other concerns are a priority. So let's jump on to the next slide. So I want to give you a little background on the UPT, a historical perspective, so you can appreciate the labor of love, so to speak, that's gone into this, and the amount of time and the amount of input that we've gotten from our community. So with that, let me jump to the next slide. So it all started with a thought. Next slide. So the idea was there was a lot of regulatory burden, and in the past, there were 100 different versions at 100 different institutions of protocol forms. Each one of these forms was developed in a way to meet the needs and the goals of the institution. And those needs and goals often far went beyond the information that the IACUC needed to successfully review and approve animal activities. So the idea behind a protocol form, a universal form, was to find something that all the institutions have to be concerned with when gathering data to provide to the IACUC, i.e. the information the committee needs to understand the animal activities that are being performed and understand how the impact will, or how the research will impact the animals and how we can meet the concerns. The idea was to develop this form in a manner that there were no regulatory gaps or no compliance failures. And it was important that the entire community of IACUC administrators and institutions were confident that this document was effective, was efficient, and did indeed meet the regulatory requirements. Obviously, the second objective, just as strong as the first, in that ensuring animal welfare, is to ensure researchers have the ability to conduct and facilitate effective and efficient research, and importantly, progress from one stage of research to the other and thrive in the information found. So it's a dream, but one that can be reality. And the idea of developing a single form first came to our plate, or our list of tasks, early on. So with that, let's jump on to the next slide. So what are the benefits to be gained? So there were several things that were talked about when we first brought this idea up. And one thing was, if we all had a document and all of us as a community agreed that the information in that form did indeed meet the regulatory requirements, then we as a community and as individuals in that community were confident, as long as that document, i.e. the UPT, Universal Form, was completed in its entirety with good, thorough answers to the questions, that it would indeed meet the ethical and the legal expectations. Secondly, a lot of us collaborate from one institution to the other. We have MOUs, depending on your institution. Your process may be to see your collaborators' IACUC protocol form to see if the attention being paid by your collaborators' IACUC is consistent with your own. The idea of having a single protocol form gives us some confidence that the form that we reviewed here at my institution is consistent with the same form that's being reviewed and approved at one of my collaborators' institution. In addition, using this standard form streamlines the review process for the IACUC and also for the administrators. It allows PIs to complete this document in a way that they know the information being provided to the IACUC is exactly what they need. It's not going beyond what the committee needs. It does indeed provide the information that the committee needs to assess the animal activities, understand pain levels, understand, for example, that anesthesias, analgesias, and other pain relieving measures are being taken to ensure the animals are receiving the attention they need and the veterinary care they need to get through a study. The end of the day is the product has it's a balanced model that helps meet the regulatory requirements, and it minimizes the administrative fatigue for both IACUC administrators, IACUC program or institutional compliance directors, and researchers. It does reflect the community's commitment to both supporting research and helping to facilitate activities in the best effective and efficient way possible. So with that, jump on next slide, please. So a really quick introduction to the IACUC Administrators Organization. This is our 25th year. Believe it or not, if you know us and you've been involved with our activities, and many have been involved for 25 years, my hair wasn't gray and I had some 25 years ago, so I can't believe 25 years has gone by so quickly. But we started with activities 25 years ago that involved IACUC administrators sitting in roundtable discussions and talking about things like the Universal Protocol Forum. Past events always involved representatives from OLAW, representatives from the USDA, and almost always from ALAC as well. We've had individuals from NERA to Dr. Brown, who is now retired from OLAW, involved, and Dr. Goldentire and Gibbons and some of the new people that are joining the USDA participate. Obviously, in 2020, when the pandemic hit, it kind of threw us all for a loop, and we jumped on this idea of doing more virtual meetings, and the IAA still continues to do its virtual meetings, but we are traveling again and doing in-person meetings. So next slide, please. Just wanted to give you an idea of this organization. We developed it with the idea of providing a professional home for IACUC administrators. And this is where we take the opportunity to sit around and, for lack of better terms, vent on things that are causing issues or concerns at our own institutions. We're looking for ideas. Maybe my problem is something that you fixed or you resolved at your institution and vice versa. So this really gave us a hub or an opportunity to sit down and exchange knowledge and information, identify and create best practices, and kind of form a more collaborative and cohesive organization of IACUC administrators. We did take minutes, excessive minutes, during our IACUC administrators meetings for probably 10 to 15 years, and the contents of those minutes turned into a textbook. I think it's the IACUC Administrator's Guide to Program Management, and Ron and I authored that about 5 or 6 years ago. We're working on the second edition, but the important thing of that text isn't that it's a text that we developed, my words and Ron's words. It is a text that basically outlines what our community talked about for the past 15 to 20 years. So it's out there, and it is again, something that came out of this group, but more importantly, it relates to this endeavor of developing a UPT. The important point I want to make is it was initiated through the Association of IACUC Administrators, and we all talked about it. Next slide. So the first time we tried to do this, it was in 2006 and 2007, and everyone held on to the idea that their protocol form was the one and only. And it was very difficult for people to think outside of that box. And one of the things that we found was that everybody believed that because of unique research portfolios at unique institutions, that developing a forum such as this wasn't even on the table. So there was an unconscious bias that remained through the years, and the idea of this UPT kind of sunset back in 2007 after one of our initial discussions. Next slide. Reconsiderations. So as we progressed and we all understood that all institutions, no matter their research portfolios, had to follow the same regulatory requirements. And we knew, for example, that the minimum requirements were consistent no matter the type of research you were doing. As long as there was an animal model involved, 3A, B, and C, for example, all the protocols required the justification for the number of animal used. Whether or not you were doing food and fiber studies in a dairy cow herd, or whether or not you were working with mice on biomedical research, there was always a requirement for a description of procedures and ways to minimize pain and distress. Again, no matter the type of research that you were doing, and no matter the models that you were using. And last but certainly not least, from an example perspective, institutions and the regulations required all of us to make sure that people working with and handling animals were indeed trained to do this, and there were veterinarians involved, and that we had practices to ensure the regulations were satisfied. So regardless of the research focus, the foundational expectations are universal, and being able to demonstrate through some sort of UPT or standardized form would still allow us to meet these minimum regulatory requirements without any worry, no matter your research portfolio, of compromising research or the use of animals in research. Next slide. So the push that was needed came along as there was an evolution for federal regulations. The debate over these regulations, that there were too many regulations, we were over-regulated, and this was impeding the ability for researchers to do their research. Over the years, there were multiple surveys performed through organizations like FDP and COGR, and all of these are groups that are looking into regulatory burden. And in almost all cases, when asked, principal investigators in subsequent years responded to surveys in a way that indicated they spend between 40 and 45% of their time satisfying regulatory requirements, whether it's an IRB requirement, whether it's an IACUC requirement, a biosafety requirement, or some other regulatory concern. There were always efforts being placed on regulation rather than on bench work and research. So with that, around the President Obama presidency, there was acknowledgement that the concerns around a regulatory burden was something that should receive more attention. We should look to ways to reduce regulatory burden, yet still satisfy the primary goals in an animal world of ensuring the health and well-being of animals, using animals only when necessary, and minimizing pain and, yes, distress when these animals are being involved in studies. Then around 2016, Obama put forth the idea of the 21st Century Cures Act, which was indeed a law that required the minimizing or reconsideration of the regulatory standards and ways that they could be reduced, yet still satisfy the expectations and the concerns around the primary focus of whichever the regulations were: IACUC, biosafety, human subjects. The Cures Act was a broad reach to get researchers back to the lab and away from the regulation table, or minimize to the necessary regulatory attention placed. Next slide. So continued momentum when Donald Trump came into presidency, he actually implemented the Cures Act. In addition to the Cures Act, he introduced a bold policy requiring federal agencies to eliminate 2 regulations for every one they created. The 2-for-1 rule really prioritized deregulation, and it aimed strongly at looking at regulatory requirements. The idea wasn't to make a free-for-all and make it easy for anyone to circumvent the expectations of the regulations, but to really spend a lot of time considering the goal of these regulations and making sure that as we progressed and as we developed more regulations, that we streamlined things better to make it much easier for us to ensure the regulation is satisfied. I think it's important for me to say that as an IACUC director and have made a career of this, it's all of us should realize that we are a service-oriented group. So we know the regulations and the researchers know the research. So that partnership is important. Researchers are depending on us to help them satisfy the regulations and make their regulatory confidence or compliance confidence strong. A researcher should be able to walk out of a lab or walk into a lab and meet the IACUC and be confident that what they're doing is compliant and not be concerned when they're talking to the IACUC or compliance director that something is wrong or something that deviates from the regulation is going to be found. Let's go to the next slide. So all aboard, the Cures Act was kind of the arm twist that got not just the IACUC Administrators Association moving even more on this universal protocol form, but also was the key to get federal agencies to take a closer look at this. So with the Cures Act, both OLAW and the USDA participated and looked at the opportunities that UPT could produce and helped us to look at how the UPT could indeed minimize redundancies in submissions. In other words, ensure that what we gather for IACUCs is the information they need and only what they need as a committee to look at animal activities that are proposed and to get them reviewed and approved. The Cures Act was kind of a driving force to help us all focus on and look at reducing administrative burden. And it also helped to express or help to get federal agencies more involved and more in the collaboration of this particular document. This led to the partnership with FDP. And once this partnership with FDP was formalized, we developed a dedicated subcommittee to take a look at UPT again. I think it's important to mention that the UPT or the form that we were going to look at or that we were looking at as part of FDP was a product of the IACUC Administrators Association and something that Dr. Banks and I worked a lot with on our colleagues or with our colleagues to develop this format. So can we jump to the next slide? I'm going to pause for a moment. Ron, I see you jumped on. You want to say hello for a second and just introduce yourself?
Hey guys, Ron Banks here from the Central Prairies of Oklahoma, where apparently internet doesn't always work in the morning. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late, but Bill and I have worked together for more than 20 years, so I can probably tell you what he's talked about for the last few minutes. I started out in my biomedical research career in the Army. I moved into academic medicine, and then have worked with Bill now, as I noted, for more than 20 years. I joined, as he was saying, the efforts that we had put into the UPT. And yes, we did put a little bit of time in, but the real credit goes to the community of IACUC administrators who've been flustered and frustrated for so many years with the variations of protocols across the system, the challenges of working in between institutions, and the challenges of getting new researchers when they get on board to understand the local lingo. So it's been both a exercise in love and longevity, and sure hoping that this can go ahead and get across the finish line.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it, Ron. So looking back to the slide, so the development through collaboration, once we got our form moved into an FDP subcommittee, we developed this group from obviously member organizations that were part of FDP. And what we did was we reanalyzed the form, and this reevaluation of the UPT was performed by IACUC administrators from academia. We had someone from VA. We also had folks from industry. We had large organizations, large programs, small programs. So what we wanted to do was to get a really good look at this document, or shall I say, a final analysis of this form with input from all of the users. At that time, we also had representatives from both OLAW and the USDA involved, and they were participating in taking a look at the form and providing input and ideas. Once we were in the FDP mode, I know that Dr. Wolf from OLAW and myself did sessions along with Ron at Priminar. We did sessions at for IAA, and we did webinars. So we had a lot of interaction with folks along the way. We had a lot of input from our subcommittee. And again, we worked with our partners from the USDA and OLAW through this entire subcommittee process. So the team approach was to, as I mentioned, systematically look at this, and how we addressed it. We broke it into sections. We had areas of the document that were considered administrative, and I'm not going to go into the details. You'll see it when I show the form. What areas that we're looking at personnel qualifications and justifications and things like that. So we were really touching on all of the important points. The idea was to word the questions and ideas in a way that emphasized on clarity, on usability, and flexibility. So we really wanted to take a look at this document in a way that it could indeed work for everyone, and that it did focus on the minimum requirements, and it was very clear by the user that those minimum requirements were met. I will say in point 4, the unconscious bias I mentioned earlier in 2007 and 8 remained, and those folks on the subcommittee had a lot of problems or a lot of issues trying to look at this form outside of the scope of their own. So as we had discussions, it was not uncommon for Ron and I to hear, well, my form says this and we need this, or your form says that and you need that. And even though we focused on the idea that the form that we needed to develop was the minimum information needed for us to have a compliant protocol form, and that could be a basis, and all institutions would be able to add all those, I have to have this and we need to have those to the minimum, we still struggled getting through even some of the simplest parts of this as a subcommittee. And when I say struggle, I mean we couldn't come to total agreement on the information. And I'll tell you to the detail, we sat for, I don't know, an hour subcommittee meeting, and we were trying to decide whether or not the PI information needed to include a phone number, needed to include an office, needed to include an emergency contact. So it was that nitty gritty, so to speak. And it certainly was an impediment, and it made things very difficult for us as a group to come to a general conclusion on what the minimum requirements were that should be there, when everybody was focusing a lot on the extra things that were needed by their own institution.
I can't tell you the number of times that we heard Axel tell us that the research community was our own biggest enemy, that the things that we were insisting the protocol template were not being required by any sort of oversight or regulatory agency. And it really forced us to go back and ask this question: why do we have such a large institutional bias in our protocol templates? Came to the conclusion there were really 2 reasons for that. One was we've always done it that way before. And so people at institutions had gotten comfortable with their status quo. Not that that's bad, but they had gotten comfortable with the way they did it there. They had learned works or workarounds with their processes, and therefore they saw theirs as being the absolute best since they had solved those challenges. But when visiting other institutions, we would have those same discussions, and even within the subcommittee have those same discussions, and folks would categorically say, it will never work here. you'd ask why, it just would not ever work here, which again related to we've always done it this way before. The second consideration on the bias of individual institutional protocol forms was really a fear factor. And it was a fear factor that if we did not have this question, or if we did not ask it in this manner, then we would receive a citation or some other adverse oversight action from one of the regulatory or oversight agencies, whether it would be USDA, OLAW, or even ALAC from that perspective. I can't tell you the number of times I heard people say, well, this is a question required by OLAW, or this is a question that the USDA VMO always wants to know the answer to. Those are interesting responses, but as Bill had noted, the whole goal of the UPT was to get back to the minimum requirements under the law and under regulation, so that we could start once again with a fresh baseline that all institutions could compare the same answer to the same question and make life, shall we say, easier indeed for getting things approved, but make life also more consistent with the expectation of researchers and researchers using animals.
Thank you, sir. Next slide. So as we continued through the whole idea of the subcommittee with UPT, President Biden came into power and he kind of refocused the aggressive deregulation concept to other priorities. So kind of the idea behind the Cure Acts diminished a bit, not to say that it went away. It just didn't have the same focus. So as I mentioned, and as Ron mentioned, FDP subcommittee members were just simply unable to agree on an acceptable outcome, and finalizing the UPT has kind of shifted back to Ron and I as part of IAA and also to the IACUC administrative community to finalize the document. It is important to note that the progress made through FDP is critical. We got a lot of input from our colleagues from a different perspective, and we got a lot of input from our colleagues in the regulatory world, both USDA and OLAW. So although the project didn't have the final involvement of the feds, so to speak, under the 21st Century Cures Act initiative, the federal agencies at that point kind of withdrew and said, okay, we've spent the time that we need to spend. We've talked about this. We've given advice to the subcommittee. We've given thoughts to the subcommittee. And now it's time to put this to bed. So therefore, it's back to IAA and us. And I want to thank Nia and others here for allowing us to bring this forward to you and kind of finalizing this through the academies and making this available to all of you through this particular resource. So with that, let's jump on to the next slide. So as we know, Trump is back. Next slide. So conversations around regulatory burden, even before Trump was inaugurated, he started talking about regulatory burden again, and he went from his 1 to 2 to now 1 to 10. And importantly, I saw this morning where Trump put a halt on the advancement of regulations until it is looked at by a subcommittee. So some of these regulations that we're looking at right now to put into place have been slowed. Some stopped, some have been paused for up to 60 days. End of the day, the point to be made here is that as President Trump did during his first term, he indeed is doing it again now, and that is refocusing us on regulatory burden and the idea of reducing regulatory burden in our community to a level where we can get researchers actions focused on regulations, more focused back to the lab and the research. So let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to pivot to what the UPT looks like. I had to give you some background. I wasn't sure if everyone had or was familiar with the idea behind UPT, but let's take a look at the UPT now, and then we'll give opportunities for questions as we go along the way. So the idea behind UPT was to standardize the information being collected. The idea, again, as I mentioned earlier, and as we've focused on before, is to gather the minimum information the IACUC needs to review and approve animal activities. That is indeed the IACUC's job, to review and approve the animal activities and ensure once they are reviewed and approved, they are overseen on a regular basis. And oversight isn't just the protocol. We do semi-annual inspections and program reviews all the time. We look in the facilities at animals and make sure they're being cared for. They get appropriate veterinary care. We look and do a program review and make sure that our training is efficient and effective and personnel are appropriately trained. We do all kinds of things to oversee the animal activities once they're approved. So it is really important to point out that the protocol form and the importance of that form is to bring to the attention of the IACUC those activities that are going to be performed. The committee needs to understand what's being performed, and that document is a resource for the committee, for the veterinarians and others. So when they do walk into Ron's lab and they see some animals in the vivarium, that they know what those animals are being used for, and they have this protocol form as a resource. So again, it is important to say, and I know I keep reiterating, that this document has the minimum requirements, and it is informative enough for the committees, IACUC committees here, there, and everywhere, to gather the minimum information they need to understand the activity, to assess the activity, and finally approve the activity. Next slide. So if we talk about two different types of protocols, and you'll see these are the extremes, and this was kind of one of the exercises that Ron and I went through probably years ago, just to make a comparison and contrast. You have two worlds, two contrasting approaches for the IACUC protocol forms emerged. One is driven by a shared goal, and that is to uphold the ethical and regulatory standards of animal research. Yet when we looked at these forms, they diverged dramatically in the way they sought to achieve a balance or to achieve these ideas. So let's go to the next slide. So the first is that protocol form that gathers excessive information, the form towering with details. It is unwavering in detail. It includes every possible question that could be asked, every single scenario that could be encountered, and it covers every thought that could emerge from an animal activity, whether it's expected, anticipated, or a possibility. With this particular type of form, the researchers were facing very time-consuming processes, not just filling out the form, but navigating the pages and working with the IACUC to get it completed and getting the information approved, reviewed, and approved. We did surveys through the years, and we found that a lot of the information being collected was either redundant, and by redundant, I mean information was provided in perhaps the detailed description of what's going to occur, and then later on in an animal procedure, and then somewhere else in an experimental design. So we would find duplication or even the same information in three different places. And then occasionally we would find irrelevant information altogether that really had nothing to do with the animal activity or nothing to do with the research being performed.
And I
So
might
part of
add,
this is,
I
go ahead,
might
Ron.
add that some of that duplication was to the benefit of a particular, shall we say, user group. Some institutions would say we've got to duplicate in several places to be sure the IACUC members find that information. And so it was creating a document that was more friendly to the reviewer and less friendly to the researcher. Even though the information was there, if one just simply would look for it, it was, let's make it easy for the reviewer to look at. And in trying to make it easy, it actually became more complex because of the redundancy and the opportunity to have errors. even in transfer of statements or phrases or the way it's being presented.
Thank you. Yeah, at the end of the day, the idea behind this form is that it created and gathered significant amount of information. And it did exactly what Ron mentioned before. It made the compliance directors comfortable because, you know, they knew it was right because it was done twice or it was done 3 times. And we were comfortable and satisfied with the fact that we, beyond a reasonable doubt or beyond any doubt, satisfied the regulatory requirements. The difficulty associated with this is the researcher fatigue, the relationships that were strained because of the back and forths between committees, between compliance directors and researchers, and just the amount of time that it took for us to get this protocol, first of all, written in a way that it could be reviewed and approved, and secondly, approved. So let's jump to the next slide. And here you will see the idea behind, you know, the Goldilocks protocol, in other words, just right. So this particular form, it embraced a different philosophy, and this is kind of the roots of the UPT. So the idea was to do an assessment of many different protocol forms. So as we went through the years, we had IACUC administrators bring their forms or submit their forms electronically to us. We didn't single out any, but we did identify questions on slides for discussions. We also used a form that, and I think I'll have a slide later, that Axel developed many years ago as a resource for OLAW. That particular form, the idea behind it was to reach out, and I believe through discussion, Axel told me that he looked at many, many different forms across the community, not with the idea of developing something that OLAW expected, again, anyone to use, but rather the idea of a repository for the various questions that we as a community have come up with and used on our protocol forms. So that document was a great tool for us to start with, and we used that along the way. And we also got a lot of input from our community based on their own forms and their own justifications, things like that. Next slide. So anyway, as we reflect on these 2 slides or these 2 types of forms, the idea was, you know, one does indeed provide comfort to the institutions that everything is kosher in the idea of regulatory compliance. But is it possible? And this was the idea that we put forward when we mentioned UPT, to kind of pare that down, understanding that institutions have their own desires and unique needs, but for us to at least take all of those forms, including the one that OLAW had, or had it for us as a reference, and distill it down into one document, this UPT, which indeed was the form that gathered the minimum requirements. Next slide. Next slide, please. So if we look at this, the 2 scenarios that we've already gone over is the idea of overregulation and the idea of that minimum acceptable information. And we just give an example here. You know, there are 2 ways to ask about blood collection. One idea may be that we provide on that overregulated form the amount of blood that's being collected, how frequently it's being collected, the route it's being collected, and all of those extraneous details. If we come back to the Goldilocks theory, or the idea of the minimum requirements, remembering that all IACUC programs or all animal care and use programs have a training component, and we are verifying that everyone is trained to do a procedure, i.e. collect blood. Many of us have a guideline that says if you collect more than 10% of the animal's body weight in blood over a 2-week period, you are exceeding what would be considered a welfare concern for those animals. So on the Goldilocks protocol, the idea is for a PI just to check the assurance box and say, yes, I'm going to collect blood, but I will not exceed that level that the IACUC has approved, i.e. the level that will create an a burden or a welfare concern for the animals. Remember, it's important with that assurance statement that we've already validated the PI is trained and we already know, or we couldn't approve them to do the work, that they can indeed perform blood collection and know what they're doing. So just an example and a concept to remember as we go through some of these slide questions or UPT questions. Next slide. So just a further disclaimer, this is OLAW's form. This was the IAA starting point. And as OLAW is not going to endorse or require the use of the UPT. Next slide. The resource that OLAW has on their website, the sample protocol form that's there now, they did not require or mandate the use of that either. It is simply a resource. So what we did was we took this particular document and we used it as a starting point. In addition to that, we also gathered the information from our colleagues to develop the UPT. Next slide. The idea behind UPT, and I've said it enough, and I'm just going to jump ahead for the sake of time, is just making sure that we get the information the IACUC needs and no more than that. It is important to say that through Neighbor and through other surveying institutions, we did identify that about 85 to 90% of the animals used in research are rats and mice. So you'll see the nuances in UPT focus on rats and mice to make things a little easier for those users, but nevertheless, it doesn't exclude gathering information that we need should guinea pigs or hamsters be involved. So let's go to the next slide. Here is that citation. We put it here for a specific reason. So you'll understand when you see us write specific questions related to mice and rats, that this was the impotence behind that. We figured if 95% of the laboratory animals are mice and rats, then by making and streamlining some of the questions for mouse and rats users, then we are probably making things much easier for 95% of the researchers that are filling these forms out. Next slide. So the UPT in its entirety is about 20 pages. There's a lot of check boxes. There's assurance statements. There's tables that need to be filled in. And there are ways to check prescribed procedures. In other words, details or information on prescribed procedures. So let's start taking a look at some of this. So let's go to the next slide. So this is where we're gathering the information on demographics. So what do institutions need to know? They definitely need to know who's in charge, who's the PI. You need to know how to get in touch with the PI, because some institutions have requirements internally as to who can be a PI. We entered that as a B, 1B. What's your position? The regulations don't define a PI. The regulations do say that the people working on the protocol need to be trained and qualified. But at the end of the day, we settled in that the UPT should allow us the information necessary to understand who the PI is and how to contact the PI. Next slide. So again, remember, for a lot of this to work, you have to trust your PIs, and all of you know whether or not you do, and all of you know where your concerns are. And I will say, in defense of PIs, and all of us know this to be true, you've got your list of PIs that you have to pay a little extra attention to, but 95% of your PIs want to do the right thing. So the important thing is for us to help them do the right thing and make sure they understand what those requirements are. And some of the ideas behind this form is to not only gather the information for the IACUC, but to also train them and help them understand what those things are. Next slide. Go ahead, Ron.
Every PI I've ever talked to has said to me in a protocol review, you tell me what you're looking for, and I will see if I can fit that into my research paradigm. And most of the time they can. The point of UPT as well is to stop the guessing game between what the IACUC expects to see and what the PI thinks the IACUC is expecting to see. So be open, be transparent, put the things in there that can check box, things that are consistent at the institution, let the PI explain things that are different or deviate from what would be normal procedure, normal expectation.
Thanks, sir. So we wavered on this statement, but after talking to people on the subcommittee, it was recommended. And the reason it's recommended is because it's important for PIs to understand that a protocol form is equivalent to a contract. And that contract is between the IACUC representing the institution and the PI. The contract says what you can and can't do. So, well, no, I shouldn't say can't. The contract is what you can do. So PIs need to understand, and this is part of education, that they are free to amend protocols along the way, but what's approved is what they can do. So this is kind of a statement just to reiterate that, and it is an opportunity for your IACUC administrators or your institution to train on that concept or that idea of a contract or an expectation. Next slide. So we're going to start with some assurance statements. One of the things that we tried to do was look at questions or opportunities to satisfy the regulations simply by telling the PI the expectation and asking them to validate or verify that indeed that's what they're going to do. So let's take a look at the next slide and some of these assurance statements. So according to federal regulations, you must provide written assurance that all the personnel have been trained. So in this particular example, we're listing personnel. We intentionally did not list their training on the form because your institution should have training programs, and 95% of the administrators that attended and 95% of the IACUCs indicated that they indeed have methods to validate people have completed their training before the protocol or before they're able to work with animals. So by having a name and a unique identifier such as an email address, the IACUC administrator can still look at the personnel and make sure they have the training according to their program. The IACUC doesn't need to know the training. The IACUC needs to know that it is being validated, that the training has been completed. And 90% of the time in the institutions do that through the administrator. Were all of the webinar or online trainings completed? Has everyone completed this training or that training? So the IACUC makes sure that this occurs through typically an administrative process. This assurance lets us know that's going to happen. Next slide. Protocol and grant congruency. I don't know if you've seen the recent opportunity for kind of a, I won't say it's kind of an expansion in that, if you recall, the old process was we had to list all of the procedures that were going to be performed in year 4 and 5 in the protocol, get them reviewed and approved. There's a little more flexibility. I'm not going to go into that. If you go to OLAW's last statements on protocol and grant congruency, you'll find the information there. But as you see, this particular question allows us to understand if it's NIH funded, NSF, or otherwise. And the idea here is to grab that information so we can verify that all the procedures in the grant have been considered by the IACUC, reviewed and approved as necessary and as with the expectations of PHS policy, and importantly, the terms and conditions of a grant. So let's go to the next slide and next. So locations, we need to know where the animals are. That's because the IACUC needs to do the inspection. So let's go to the next slide and move my location. So there you go. So please check yes to provide assurance that all animal activities will occur in the institution's central animal facilities. In other words, areas that are part of your inspection list. So you've got a vivarium, you've got animals housed in the vivarium. Some of you have labs in the vivarium that are used on a regular basis. They're part of your list. They're part of your veterinary walkthroughs. They're part of the things your husbandry team sees all the time. So what do we need to know? Where are the areas outside of that? In other words, whose PI labs are going to be used? And here we have a question that allows the IACUC administrator to grab the meeting or I'm sorry, the room number and the building so that we know where other activities outside of the central vivarium will be performed. We know what species, and importantly, we know what the activities are. Again, the minimum requirement here is for the IACUC to do the inspections and make sure those areas qualify for animal use. So we need to gather that information to be able to satisfy that regulatory requirement. Next slide. Rationale for using animals. We know that one of the requirements is not to unnecessarily duplicate research. And we know from the perspective that PIs are not going to be able to publish things that have already been published. Nevertheless, to ensure we satisfy this requirement, we have an assurance that basically states that the PI is telling us that they are not duplicating something they've already done themselves or duplicating something someone else has done, and that their research continues to identify potential medical advancements that improve health and well-being of humans and or animals. So this actually satisfies two of the U.S. government principles and the two regulatory requirements. Not duplicating, and the research indeed is improving the health and well-being of our humans and animals. Next slide. Another assurance statement looking at the rationale for using animals. Check yes to provide assurance, and all of you have seen this before, and all of you are looking for a response that reflects the fact that you cannot use a petri dish, you can't use a computer model, and you can't use simulations. And the idea is that a PI or a researcher has already exhausted those efforts, and the need to assess research in a complete biological system is important. Obviously, we're looking for a yes here from the PI. If the answer is no, we've got text boxes for them to explain the reasoning and the rationale, and more importantly, it's an opportunity for the IACUC to reach back to the PI with questions. Again, we've just looked at three assurance statements that traditionally were exhausting paragraphs on the old forms that in effect, we were looking through paragraphs trying to find one, two, or three sentences that got to the points that we've summarized or distilled down in these into these assurance statements. Next slide. Also training, and I understand. So next slide, just so we can see. So animal procedures. So according to federal regulations, we're talking to the PI. It is your responsibility to minimize the discomfort, pain, distress that may be associated with the activities proposed. Check yes to provide assurance that these measures will be addressed. So this is again an education or a training opportunity for the PI, letting them know that later on when they have to use or alleviate pain and distress, we're going to be looking for that information. So we want them to be aware that whatever they're proposing, the requirement is to minimize pain, distress, and discomfort. Another assurance statement, and move on. Let's jump to the next slide. This is the rationale for using animals. So here we have a text box related to the use of vertebrate animals. Briefly describe the objectives and a general description of this project in language that can easily be understood by our non-scientific members. So this is a question all of you see, all of you are familiar with. In one way, shape, or form, you have it on your current form. And this is, why are you doing this work? And tell us the reasoning behind it. Next slide. Straight out of the guide, provide a clear and concise sequential description of what procedures will be performed on animals. This is from A to Z. This is from being born to being euthanized. This description should allow the IACUC to understand the experimental course of an animal from the time it enters until the time or the endpoint of the study. We do, and we emphasize through a note that we don't need the details. You've seen this plenty of times where people tell us, we're going to do this surgery, we're going to do that surgery, and here's how we're going to do it. And then later on, when they get to the procedures section, they're asking or answering with the same information. think about that from an administrator's perspective. You've got to ensure congruency between question A and the questions in the surgical section, for example. Importantly, the PI is looking to see how did they answer it in question A and then in question D later on. So this eliminates the chance for error, and it definitely eliminates redundancy. So next slide. Continuing with the concept behind the minimum number of animals being used, it is important to say that the expectation is that scientific aims will be met with statistically valid results. It is also important to say that the regulation says when possible. All of us look at this with a lot of considerations. One extreme would be to have a statistician on your IACUC, and the statistician looks at the proposed numbers, and part of that analysis is making sure that the data would be statistically justified or valid. The other concept to think about is unless the data is statistically valid, the researchers aren't going to be publishing. Remember, behind the scenes, all of our researchers are sharing their information or hoping to share through publication. So that means their endeavors are to ensure that they have statistically valid results. Again, the minimum requirements is to make sure that it is considered and when possible employed. Another assurance statement that helps us remind PIs the requirement and gives the IACUC an opportunity to look into proposed numbers at the detail they wish. Next slide. So experimental design, we want to know what animals are being used, what are the minimum that are needed to achieve the valid results, and what are the maximum. So this gives us an idea of what is needed, whether or not you want this to be validated through 15 experimental groups times 20 animals times 4 replications gives us that number, is up to you. If you combine this idea with the idea that we previously looked at, the assurance statement, minimum needed to validate the results, then this allows you a little more flexibility so you understand what the PI believes is the minimum needed and the maximum needed. And it gives committees and institutions the opportunity to say, yeah, that's reasonable. And if somebody says, I'm going to need 2 million animals, it gives the institution the opportunity to say, yeah, right, you can't use 2 minimum animals in a 3-year period. Again, this is that minimum information needed for the IACUC. Next slide. So animal information, what will happen to the animals after the study is completed? We need to know, what is the ultimate disposition of these animals. A lot of research, and we know this, ends in euthanasia because details are needed or physiological studies are performed, tissues are collected. But there are also other things that many institutions do, and that includes adopting animals out. It includes retiring animals to sanctuaries, depending on species and things like that. We need to realize that most of our laboratory animals, from the perspective of mice and rats, are transgenic anyway. And I don't say that haphazardly. When I say anyway, it makes research more effective. If we've got a strain of mice that are naturally going to be diabetic, then those mice can be used for diabetes research, and they are. So these are the ones that frequently are used through the course of a study, and they are euthanized and tissues are collected or other things are performed. End of the day, this lets us know once the study's done what's happening to the animals. Next slide. Housing requirements, you'll see here that we've formulated a question to basically let PIs know that we have standard housing requirements for animals, that our veterinarian and our husbandry teams make sure they are satisfied, and that their animals will be handled that way. If for some reason the study requires a deviation from the standard practices, then they need to check no and tell us what those deviations are. That could be No enrichment because it's a behavior study. That could be wire bottom cages because it's a metabolism study, or that could be alterations in light. The end of the day, the purpose here is to give PIs an opportunity to tell us whether or not they're not going to use standard housing and tell us what those departures may be. Next slide. This just reiterates the regulation. So let's go to procedures. And next slide. So some of the common procedures we just simply spelled out, especially since 95% are mouse users. And when you see it spelled out, you'll see it's an opportunity for a checkbox. Others have text boxes. Let's take a look at some of these. And we can start with some built-in standard procedures, and we have 3 here. So if you have a lot of mice and rats at your institution, these 3 things probably happen at your institution. Mice and rats are frequently and almost always euthanized by gas inhalation, and there is a requirement for secondary method of euthanasia. Again, remember, people need to be trained before they work with animals so they know how to do the euthanasia, and they know how to do any secondary method. So from an IACUC perspective, we want to know how they're euthanized, gas inhalation, and we want to know that a secondary method occurs. Decap, pneumothorax, removal of vital organs, cervical dislocation. Doesn't matter to the IACUC as long as it's done. The IACUC just needs to make sure that it's done effectively. This eliminates the opportunity for non-compliance because somebody didn't kill a dead animal correctly. In other words, use the secondary method on their protocol. This provides more flexibility. 1% blood collection, that checkbox. Again, if you're a rat user or a mouse user and you're doing these, instead of writing these out, you check the box. We used the blood collection as an example previously, so I won't go there. But we also know that when we have mice or rats, there's genotyping. We know genotyping should be done in less than 21 days because of cartilage buildup in the tails. So we give PIs the opportunity to just check this instead of describing how they will do genotype. So these are built-in procedures and examples of built-in procedures. Next slide. Couple of more that look at endpoints. This example is tumors, and I'm not going to read them to you. The idea behind this is whatever your institution's policy is on tumor development, that you build in these endpoints so that those studying oncology at your institutions can just check boxes. Next slide. Surgical procedures. So how many times do we ask folks to spell out aseptic technique and tell us how they're going to do it, how they're going to prep, how they're going to remove hair and all of that? We've included it right in the UPT so they can check a box and say, yes, we're going to follow this. If not, provide the method you're going to use. We want to know a descriptive name of the procedure so we can reference it throughout the protocol and we understand what they're doing when we read a surgery record. And importantly, we want to know that the information regarding anesthesia and analgesia will be provided, which isn't a subsequent question, but how will you do the procedure? So a brief description of the surgery. Next slide. More specific information by species. So again, this is the prep. So if you're using mammals, are you going to do it this way? If your answer is yes, check yes. If not, tell us how you're going to deviate. And here again, we looked at multiple forms and multiple ways of prepping and distilled it down into the information that our group believes the IACUCs need. Next slide. Minimizing pain and discomfort. The argument can be made that this has been taught part of the surgical training. Again, I'm going to emphasize on training and not gathering all that here, but making sure you have a complete training program at your institution. So next slide. This is where we talk about things that we often look at as part of part of surgery, thermoregulation and ointments to make sure that the eyes don't dry out. Next slide. post-surgical support, requirements for follow-up, anesthesia, analgesia information, gathering all of that here, substance, species, doses, methods of application and frequency. So how often will the animal get analgesia after a surgery? We gather all of that here. All of you that have seen protocols in the past and reviewed them, you're familiar with this type of information as well. Next slide. So this gathers the idea behind multiple survival surgeries. You can see it's very self-explanatory what's happening first, second, and third. This ensures that we are looking at different episodes of surgery, not more than one surgery under the same anesthetic event. So if you're going to do this day 1 and you're going to do this day 21, then this allows us to gather that and ensures that we can mark these protocols appropriately and handle them as we're required. Next slide. This gathers the substance administration. What are you going to give an animal? What's the purpose? Route. Here's where we're gathering information on whether or not it's hazardous. Remember, if it's hazardous, it gets deferred out to your IBC or your safety unit, and all the administrator needs to do is validate that that hazardous is being evaluated and there is a clearance in place for the use of that hazard. It's not the IACUC's job to evaluate the hazard or to evaluate the application or handling of that hazard. Just the job of the IACUC to make sure that it is occurring under the Occupational Health and Safety Program and part of an IBC or an EHS, depending on how you have it structured at your institution. Next slide. Go ahead, Ron. You have something you want to say?
Oh, just to point out on the prior slide, Bill, I wasn't going to interrupt you on that, but the administrator can do those kinds of things. We talk about the IACUC,
Exactly.
the administrator does it, and it's just a matter of confirming it's being done.
Exactly. Important point to make. Next slide. So some other things that we've spelled out around food manipulation, food restrictions or withdrawals. You know, some of this you have to look at your own policies, and we've seen some institutions say, you know, restriction is 12 hours, restriction is 18 hours. But the idea here is to, again, build in information that allows PIs to just check a box rather than to provide exhausting descriptions or explanations. And as we go through the next few, you'll see check boxes. As a checkbox is checked, then there are subsequent questions about, for example, behavior studies or breeding or things like that. So it opens up and provides more of an opportunity for descriptions and gathering the critical information needed. Let's jump to the next slide. We realize that you can't capture everything. So we try to list as many of the things, or we did a query to identify the most common things that occur at institutions. So at the end of the day, to make sure that we provided opportunities for things that weren't spelled out in the UPT, we provide this table that allows the PI to give the name of a procedure, a description of the procedure, and of course, the species that's going to be used in. And then we get into the questions about whether or not it would cause more than momentary pain or distress. Next slide. So let's jump back one, I'm sorry. Let's go back to one slide before, the slide right before this one. So we cut off providing examples here for the sake of time. This document is available on the website. And that last question that you see on this slide, will this procedure cause more than momentary pain or distress? That evolves into literature searches and the things that we need to do when there's a USDA procedure, for example, classifying it as a C, D, or an E, and then making sure that all of the painful procedures identified in the protocol do indeed have the literature search and a summary of the findings. So that is captured as well here. And that also talks about opportunities for endpoints and various things around that. So again, we gave you kind of a smattering of all the questions. It's important for you to jump onto the website and grab all of these. You'll find on the website a Word form, which is where we cut most of this information. And that Word form can be used as your minimum. And if you only have 30 protocols at your institution, I've heard some say we're just going to use the word form. And we've heard some that have 730 protocols say that they are going to just look at their current questions, which may be an electronic system, and just kind of replace and alter the way that they're being asked. Again, not mandated. If it's a resource that can help make things more efficient for you, please consider it. It's entirely up to you. In addition to this Word document, next slide. We also have an Excel version, and in the Excel version, you will see regulatory requirement, the protocol section it falls under. Is it administrative information? The specific question that's being asked, and then some general comments that came from the administrative community as we went through this. And these particular questions, as it goes from question 1 clear through the end of the document, will give you specific citations in the regulations that shows you the requirement and how they're being satisfied. Next slide. Here's an example. This particular question, rationale for involving animals in your research design, Animal Welfare Act section, PHS policy section, and the guide protocol review section, page 25. Again, the idea is we have the Word document that's user-friendly, and you can use it as you wish. And then we also have the Excel document, which was a tool for us as we continued to work through the fruition of this form. Next slide. Another example. Next slide. And that's what we have for you. Again, I will encourage you to think about some of the things that we talked about today. Think outside the box. I'm sure that many of you thought about, well, that's never going to work here and that's never going to work there. So why in the world could I, or I could never, or it just won't happen? Maybe so. And I will tell you that a lot of that is instilled back to Ron's comment. We've always done it this way, and this is the form we've always used. So it really takes an effort to think outside of that box. And I will tell you, it really takes more of an effort for you as an administrator or a director to sell it to leadership over you. It's all about what makes sense. It's all about, this is the minimum. We can add more if we want to. So I'll leave it at that. Ron, you have any other thoughts that close that out? And then let's see what we can do with a few questions.
My closing note, Bill, we've talked about before, the entire process of program management is on a spectrum, and on one end is policing and on the other end is the partnership. And it seems over the last decade or so, we have by nature moved more and more toward the policing end of that spectrum. And the encouragement is we move more toward the partner end of that spectrum, making the research community partner with the oversight community, having expectations and holding people accountable, but trying to step out of this role of being a police person on every single action, every single jot and tittle of a protocol and a practice. So we can get once again to a more balanced sort of environment and away from the extraordinary number of questions, most of which really, at the end of the day, don't have the impact that we wish that they would.
Well said. Thank you. So if you want to stop the screen share, if anyone has any questions, or if you need this, there you go. Anyone have any questions for us? Are there any questions, Mitch, that jumped up?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks, Ron. There are several questions that folks have. One that has the most votes here. I didn't see any software vendors on the collaborators list. Are there any vendors who have incorporated or looking to incorporate the UPT into their protocol management platforms?
I will tell you that intentionally, because of the commercial aspect behind vendors, that we did not have them involved. And the reason we didn't have them involved is because we purposely did not want it to be nuanced to one person's product. I've had many vendors along the way ask Ron and I what our thoughts were and if we could share. And we agreed that whenever this became a public document, which I would consider today, that it would be available for vendors to assess and think about how it may fit into the design of their own solutions and their own programs. So that at the end of the day, that was a conscientious decision that was made to not have the vendors involved in the beginning.
Let's see, similar question. Do you think international partners will readily accept the UPT? And is that something in the works?
What do you think, Ron?
I never thought international partners would accept the book that Bill and I put together on IACUC administrators. And by golly, I hear now it's being printed in other languages. So who knows? If the U.S. can become a leader in a variety of areas, maybe we can become a leader in getting back to a common sense approach to research too. So maybe we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the challenge is, the Animal Welfare Act regulations apply strictly to the U.S. PHS policy, if you have a foreign assurance and you're doing some work internationally, then it would probably work there. But, from doing ALAC site visits, and Ron has done more international than I, you may run into different regulations or different expectations that drive what a protocol form looks like, in an international colleague's country. So it's hard to say.
Mitch, let me also add, though, I don't want it to mean or people to surmise we didn't take a look anywhere beyond the USA borders. In fact, we did look at Canadian Council requirements and protocols at one point, and you may see some things that appear to have a parallelism up there. So it doesn't mean it couldn't be used, but our community was US, and our user group were administrators and researchers, and trying to find a common ground for both of them to speak a simple language and get IACUCs to do their job more efficiently and effectively was really the goal.
Thank you both. We have time for one more. I know we're going a little bit over, but get one more in here. Was there any discussion about the use of the 3 R's language, replace, reuse, replace, reduce, refine? This would align with AWA requirements while also making the information more compatible with ethical standards globally.
Yeah, I think a lot, and I think you should weigh in too here, Ron, too, for the veterinary perspective. But the theme behind all of this and behind all of the questions and the regulatory requirements are a refine, replace, and reduce perspective. So collectively, any protocol form, including this one, has a focus of all of that. For example, the minimum number of animals used, or a literature search looking for a less painful procedure, or an assurance stating that we will ensure that pain management occurs. All of this is refinement, replacement, and reduction. Can we use a computer model? If they check yes, then that's part of those 3 R's. So my philosophy has always been that the collectively, even though we do spell it out, refine, reduce, and replace, collectively our regulations promote that whole idea. And I think the questions at large are in fact promoting and ensuring refinement, reduction, and replacement. And I'm not a veterinarian. That's my philosophy. And Ron does bring a veterinary perspective to this. That's why he and I have worked collectively. So what are your thoughts there, Ron?
Yeah, Bill ought to be a veterinarian. He has a veterinarian mindset on many things. This is also true. One of the problems, I'm a full proponent of the 3 R's. One of the problems with the 3 R's is, depending upon the group you're talking about, especially internationally, it may not be 3, it might be 4 or 5 R's. And so where do you start cutting your R's? For me, the more critical aspect of 3 R's is in education, training, and then culture. We want to build a 3R culture at our institutions, not try to teach them a particular selection of acronyms or abbreviations. We want to get them to practice and perform that way each and every day. And echoing Bill's comment, the entire UPT is built under the oversight of the 3 R's or the 4 R's. The responsibility is one we use sometimes here in the States. Responsibility to the sentience of the animals, recognizing that they too can experience distress and suffering. So how can we make their environment as stress-free? How can we make it as welfare supportive to the animals also participating in the research? So that was a deep rabbit hole that we could have gone down, but it also would focus rather substantially the entire project in a particular direction. And again, repeating, I got to, because the entire UPT is under that umbrella of the 3 Rs. It's designed under that umbrella of the 3 Rs.
Thank you both, Dr. Greer and Dr. Banks. And with that, I will say this is the conclusion of today's webinar. I want to again extend my thanks to everyone for giving their time and effort and energy to organize this webinar, as well as everyone who joined and participated in the presentations and the discussions. Thank you again on behalf of the Roundtable and on behalf of VASCR and on behalf of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine.